Warning: these stories are of a disturbing nature. They are true and could easily happen to you. If this frightens you, go and watch Teletubbies, or watch a nice family comedy or a nice family drama. But if it's being scared out of your mind that you want, then turn up the volume, turn off the lights, and enjoy. Saved by bikers. My dad worked at a beachside bar and grill when I was little. In addition to being a chef, he ran and DJ'd at the bike and car shows for the restaurant. The car shows were usually on Wednesdays, and the bike nights were on a Friday. A small detail, but important to the story. The car shows were on a school night, so I was rarely allowed to go, but my father would often bring me to the bike nights. By all accounts, I was an adorable and pretty mellow kid, and the bikers absolutely loved me. And yes, you might say that this was no environment for a little girl, but I learned a lot about loyalty and friendship from being around bikers. My dad told me that some of them would call into the restaurant just to ask if I would be there that week, and they'd often bring me stuffed animals and candy. My favourite of the bikers was the man that I affectionately called Uncle Teddy. He was a friend of my parents and an absolute mountain of a man, around 6'8" and 400 pounds easily. He was an ex-marine who loved his Harley and his cigars, and every week for 5 years he would bring me a Butterfinger and a Beanie Baby. I was 6 years old the night it happened, 2003. My father had brought me to the bike show, as he normally did, but I couldn't keep my eyes open past 8 PM. The show didn't end until 10, so my dad had gotten into the habit of putting an air mattress in the back of the restaurant, and he and Teddy would often check on me every 15 minutes. I was asleep when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was a man that I'd seen around before, and he wasn't dressed in biker gear. He was wearing a short-sleeved plaid shirt and jeans and looked greasy, but not particularly scary. He smiled at me and told me that his name was Sean, that he was a friend of my dad's, and that my dad had asked him to drive me home. My parents had tried to ingrain stranger danger in me, and they told me 1,000 times to never talk to anyone I didn't know. But he knew mine and my dad's name, as well as the nickname everyone called me. I totally bought it. I got up, grabbed the flamingo Beanie Baby Uncle Teddy had given me, and started walking towards the parking lot. Sean didn't have a bike. He had a very old 4-door sedan. He opened the back door for me, and I climbed inside. You know how in senior citizens' homes, they often have plastic wrapped around couches or chairs? That's what the backseat of his car was like. Totally covered in plastic. I think now that it was probably so there would be no trace of DNA left behind. Sean started to drive away, and to this day, I can't believe how lucky I got. He had parked the car behind the restaurant in a way that it wasn't immediately visible to the bike show, but as we pulled away, I saw Teddy heading through the door, presumably to check on me. He just happened to look up at that exact moment, probably to acknowledge the car, and I smiled at him. Uncle Teddy didn't waste a moment, didn't even stop to tell my dad what was going on. He got on his bike and was on that car's ass before we had even totally cleared the avenue that led out of the parking lot. The avenue that you had to take to get to the restaurant was long, about 1.5 miles, and then you had to go down another long road before you made it to the highway. Sean saw Teddy approaching in his rear view and attempted to speed up, but he must have realised it was futile. He'd been seen, and Teddy had his license plate number and a good description. Sean stopped the car, turned around, and told me very calmly to get out of the car. I was scared by this point, and I didn't waste a moment climbing out and running to Teddy. Sean burnt rubber driving away, and Teddy held me for a moment before putting me on the back of his bike and taking me back to my dad. By the time we got back, cops had been called, and they were surrounding the place. A lot of the show had emptied out, and my dad was sobbing, screaming on the sidewalk outside of the restaurant. I'll never forget that moment. I ran up to him, hugged him as tightly as I could, and then the rest is a blur. I talked to cops, I talked to my dad, I even went down to the station and spoke to a sketch artist. I didn't get to go home until around 2 AM. Teddy never left my side. An APB was put out on the vehicle, which had been reported as stolen. The sketch circulated around the local news stations, but it didn't turn up anything concrete. At one point, I was asked to look at a lineup, but none of them were him. Fast forward about 8 years, I was 14, and my dad decided I was old enough to know what happened. Sean had been spotted lurking around the bike show a few times before that night, and was a customer at the restaurant fairly regularly. He knew my nickname because he had been watching me for over a month. He knew my schedule, and consequently, how often Teddy and my dad checked on me. When his evil plan was botched, and Teddy brought me back to the show, everyone had left. I had assumed it was because the police had been investigating a crime scene, but I was wrong. They were all out looking for Sean. Teddy told them the make and the model of the car with the description of Sean, and one of the guys thought that he sounded like a guy that frequented one of the biker bars downtown. I remember my dad paused for a long time, and I asked him what happened after that. "They found him," he said. Dear old Dad. I was 12 the night my father tried to kill us all. It was the single worst and most influential night of my life. I'm 24 now, and I still live with the effects of this one night today. When someone who is supposed to protect you and care for you turns into the one you should be afraid of, it's pretty traumatic. You never fully get over that, and you never truly trust anyone, ever again. I am the oldest of 3 kids. I have a younger sister, who was 8 at the time of the incident, and my brother is the youngest. He was 6. For years, we lived in a relatively rural area. We weren't too far from a bigger city, but we couldn't see our nearest neighbours from our house, and we had plenty of space to play. These were the happy times. My dad worked from home for one of the countless companies that started up during the big .com boom in the 90s and made a good bit of money. That all ended with the crash in the early 2000s. My father lost his job, and we were forced to sell our house and move to a less expensive place in the city while he looked for work. The house must have been glorious in its day. It was 3 stories and very spacious. It even had 2 staircases going upstairs, a main one in the front and a smaller one in the kitchen. Sadly, the house hadn't been kept up and was not in great shape anymore. It was also not in the best neighbourhood. It wasn't exactly a ghetto, but it was definitely run down. That's how we managed to get it for the price we could afford. I remember being excited at the time, because even as a little girl, I was always interested in ghosts and monsters, and it seemed like we were moving into a haunted house. I wish this story were a ghost story about the house, but sadly, as they say, the living are more terrifying. During this time, my dad changed from the loving father he had always been to someone completely different. Someone we were all very much afraid of. He struggled to find any stable work, and began drinking and would get very violent and abusive. Most of the time it was over money. He could drink away every last cent, but how dare my mother buy food or an occasional toy for us? His rage was usually directed at my mum, but if any of us kids dared draw his attention during one of his rampages, he was always more than willing to turn on us and share the love. As the oldest, I was very protective of my younger siblings, so I would usually round them up and quietly head across the street to a small park whenever my dad would start in. That way, we were safer. If we didn't make him angry, he would leave us alone. Usually we would head back around dark, and he would be in bed passed out by then. One night, however, he was in a particularly foul mood. The yelling was worse than ever. I even heard him from the playground across the street a few times. When darkness rolled around several hours later, and we headed home, I could still hear him yelling at my mum from inside. Then I heard my mother scream in pain and fear and the sound of breaking glass. I knew something was wrong. I knew something was worse than usual. I told my brother and sister to go to the neighbours and get help, but my sister was terrified, in a panic, and wouldn't leave my side. So my 6-year-old brother ran next door alone while we cautiously approached the house. When we got inside, my mum was laying in the middle of the living room floor, bleeding. The furniture in the room was overturned, and the glass coffee table was shattered all over the floor. When she saw us, a look of terror came into her eyes, and she gasped, "Run!" But it was too late. My dad had heard us coming in, and hidden behind the front door, which he slammed shut and stepped in front of. In his hand was a large kitchen knife, which was covered in my mother's blood. His eyes were filled with rage. We did the only thing we could, and ran into the kitchen for the back door, but he was fast enough to cut us off before we could get outside. He flipped over the kitchen table in front of the door and screamed, "Where do you think you're going?" We scrambled into the back staircase, and I slammed the door, separating it from the kitchen, and locked it. We were far from safe. There was nowhere for us to go but upstairs. My father beat on the door for several seconds, and then stormed off towards the main staircase. I quietly opened the door and pulled my sister towards the basement instead of going up. Downstairs we had a playroom and a small living room. I slid the love seat out from the wall, enough for my sister to get behind it and lay down, and then pushed it back as close to the wall as I could without crushing her. I did the same thing for myself with the couch. We laid there in terror for what felt like hours. I could hear my father almost shaking the house in his rage upstairs, looking for us. It sounded like he was flipping furniture and breaking down doors. Eventually he figured out we weren't up there, and did the same thing on the level above us. Finally, I heard him coming down in the basement, and I cried, silently in terror. Just as I could see his feet step off the final stair, there was a crash upstairs, and lots of footsteps rushing into the house. My dad retreated into the dark corner of the basement, until eventually the police worked their way downstairs and arrested him. Even after they took him away, I was still too scared to move. They eventually found us, and took us upstairs where my mother was being treated by EMTs and loaded into an ambulance. She survived, although I believe he would have killed her if we hadn't come home at that moment. We have never seen my father since that night. He wrote from prison a few times, but my mum never let us read the letters. She did tell us that he said he was sorry, but that's all she would say. We never went to visit him and moved across the country shortly after. He's still locked up as far as I know. As you can imagine, the entire family spent years in counselling after that night. My younger sister has attempted suicide twice, and I still have nightmares and trust issues to this day. I don't think any of us will ever completely get over it. Don't ever put a necklace around someone's neck unless you intend to marry them. As a 23-year-old assistant manager at a pizza delivery place, I never would have imagined that a simple necklace would cause me so much fear. Even to this day, every time I see a dark early 90s Civic at night, I get the chills. Let me start at the beginning. I was an assistant manager with quite a bit of experience with the company, and had recently been transferred to a different store in the franchise. My boyfriend at the time also worked there, so I had no qualms with the idea of being there. I got along well with the employees as usual. I'm very easygoing and helpful by nature, which eventually landed me in a store of my own. I only had one bad habit. I smoked cigarettes. This meant that I would have to leave someone else in charge of the money at some point during my shift. At this particular store, the key was on a lanyard so that it could be stored on your neck, making access to the till easier. One night, after a particularly stressful lunch rush, I went outside to smoke. I was the only person who solely worked inside, so I gave the key to one of the drivers, who I foolishly trusted. To save time and effort, I placed the key around his neck, smiled, and said, "Thank you. Be back in a few minutes." I ran out the door and inhaled my cigarette as quickly as possible. Fast forward to a few days later, and that driver, Poan, asked for me to help him with some calculus homework. As a recent college dropout, majoring in mathematics, I of course agreed to assist. Everything went smoothly. He was very kind, and I didn't think much of it at the time. Shortly after this, I was transferred again to yet another store. Fast forward to a year later, all of a sudden I start receiving phone calls, almost daily, from a number I didn't know. Of course I didn't answer. I mean, who answers a call from a number they don't know? Then I started to realise they were all from the same number. I thought that it must be some telemarketing number, or something of the sort, so I continued to ignore the calls. One day, after a 14-hour shift at work, I realised I had 22 missed calls from this number, and 13 voicemails from this number. I'm sitting there wondering what the hell is going on. Then I listened to the voicemails. There were 13 voicemails from Pawan. They started out professing his love to me, then became more and more desperate, ending with 2 10-minute long voicemails of him breathing heavily and crying. I was terrified. What the hell was going on? I decided that the best thing to do was to call him back and tell him that I was not interested, that I was dating someone, and that we would never be together. This was a difficult conversation to have with someone who was acting so crazily, but I managed to do so through his grunting and sniffling. He didn't say a word. A few days later, one of the other Nepalese drivers from the same store, who I'd remained friends with, called me and explained that placing a necklace around someone's neck was something that was performed during weddings in their culture. He told me that this was all a misunderstanding caused by me putting the till key around Pawan's neck. I told him that a lanyard with a key on it does not count, and he laughed and agreed. Just to be safe, I changed my number. About a month later, I moved out to my parents' house and into my own apartment. A few months later, my mum called me and asked if I knew anyone with a dark green early 90s Civic. I told her initially that I didn't, but then I remembered that was the kind of car that Pawan drove. I called back to let her know, and my dad answered. He told me that this car was parked out in front of the house for the last couple of hours. I explained the situation to my dad, who went and had a talk with him. I thought this would be the end of it, but it wasn't. About 6 months later, I was closing the store up with 2 drivers. It was extremely busy, so we were there for quite a long time after close, about an hour. Suddenly, one of the drivers said to me with a frightened sound in his voice, "Hey, are you expecting someone?" I replied that I wasn't, and went about my business. He glanced at me briefly, and then kept staring out the front window. He turned to me and nervously said, "I think this guy is going to try to rob us." I rushed to the window and looked out. It was hard to tell at first with the dark outside, but then I realised who it was. Standing completely still, staring through the giant glass front windows. It was Pawan, with his dark green 93 Civic. He must have seen me there. Looking out at him, and he didn't even flinch. I looked at my co-worker, and immediately told him to call the police. About 10 minutes later, the police showed up. They came through the back and did not initially see Pawan standing out the front. The deputy looked out front and saw him standing there, then turned to me and asked what was going on. I told him what had happened, and he asked me if I felt unsafe. I responded with a simple yes, to which my co-worker responded, "Hey, I think he's leaving." The deputy got in his car and followed Pawan. About 20 minutes later, I got a call from the deputy, stating that it was safe for me to leave work. He told me that Pawan told him that we were in a relationship for the last 2 years, and that he called me his wife. I assured him that I was never in a relationship with this man. The deputy told Pawan not to contact me again, or there would be charges pressed. I never heard from him again. Still, until this day, every time I see a dark-coloured early 90s Honda Civic, I get the chills. I will never forget my imagined marriage, and I will never, ever put another necklace around someone's neck that is not my husband's.